Good evening, babies and gentle beans. How are you this fine day? Captain, it's good to see you. Charlie, it's good to see you. All right, we're probably just going to dive right in. We ended last time at the death of Medusa, and we are moving on from the Gorgon's head. Chapter 3 starts with Tanglewood Porch. "Was that not a fine story?" asked Eustace. "Oh, yes, yes," cried Cowslip, clapping her hands. "And those funny old women with only one eye among them. I never heard anything so strange." "As to their one tooth, which they shifted about," observed Primrose, "there is nothing so very wonderful in that. I suppose it was a false tooth. But think of your turning Mercury into Quicksilver and talking about his sister. You are too ridiculous." "And was she not his sister?" asked Eustace Bright. "If I had thought it sooner, I would have described her as a maiden lady who kept a pet owl." "Well, at any rate," said Primrose, "your story seems to have driven away the mist." And indeed, while the tale was going forward, the vapors had been quite exhaled from the landscape. A scene was now disclosed which the spectators might almost fancy as having been created since they last looked in the direction of where it lay. About half a mile distant, in the lap of the valley, now appeared a beautiful lake which reflected a perfect image of its own wooded banks and of the summits of the more distant hills. It gleamed in glassy tranquility, without a trace of a winged breeze on any part of its bosom. Beyond its further shore was Monument Mountain, in a recumbent position, stretching across the valley. Eustace Bright compared it to a huge headless sphinx, wrapped in a Persian shawl. And indeed, so rich and diversified was the autumnal foliage of its woods that the simile of a shawl was by no means too high-colored for a reality. In the lower ground, between Tanglewood and the lake, the clumps of trees and borders of woodlands were chiefly golden-leaved or dusky brown, as having suffered more from the frost than the foliage on the hillsides. Over all this scene there was a genial sunshine, intermingled with a slight haze, which made it unspeakably soft and tender. Oh, what a day of Indian summer it was going to be! The children snatched their baskets and set forth a hop, skip, and a jump, and all sorts of frisks and gambols, while Cousin Eustace proved his fitness to preside over the party by outdoing all their antics and performing several new capers, which none of them could ever hope to imitate. Behind went a good old dog whose name was Ben. He was one of the most respectable and kind-hearted of quadrupeds, and probably felt it to be his duty not to trust the children away from their parents without some better guardian than his feather-brained Eustace Bright. Shadowbrook. Introductory to the Golden Touch. At noon, our juvenile party assembled in a dell through the depths of which ran a little brook. The dell was narrow, and its steep sides from the margin of the stream upward were thickly set with trees, chiefly walnuts and chestnuts, among which grew a few oaks and maples. In the summertime, the shade of so many clustering branches, meeting and intermingling across the rivulet, was deep enough to produce a noontide twilight. Hence became the name of Shadowbrook. But now, ever since autumn had crept into this secluded place, all the dark verdure, that's one I haven't seen before, all the dark verdure was changed to gold, so that it really kindled up all the dell, instead of shading it. The bright yellow leaves, even had it been a cloudy day, would have seemed to keep the sunlight among them, and enough of them had fallen to strew all the bed and margin of the brook with sunlight too. Thus the shady nook where summer had cooled herself was now the sunniest spot anywhere to be found. The little brook ran along over its pathway of gold, here pausing to form a pool in which minnows were darting to and fro, and then it hurried onward to a swifter place, as if in haste to reach the lake, and, forgetting to look whither it went, it tumbled over the root of a tree which stretched quite across its current. You would have laughed to hear how noisily it babbled about this incident. And even after it had run onward, the brook still kept talking to itself, as if it were in a maze. It was wonder-smitten, I suppose, to find its dark dell so illuminated, and at hearing the prattle and merriment of so many children. So it stole away as quickly as it could and hid itself in the lake. In the dell of Shadowbrook, Eustace Bright and his friends had eaten their dinner. They had brought plenty of good things from Tanglewood in their baskets, and had spread them out on the stumps of the trees and on mossy trunks, and had feasted merrily, and made a very nice dinner indeed. After it was over, nobody felt like stirring. "We will rest ourselves here," said several of the children, "while Cousin Eustace tells us another one of his pretty stories." Cousin Eustace had a good right to be tired, as well as the children, for he had performed great feats that memorable afternoon. Dandelion, Clover, Cowslip, and Buttercup were almost persuaded that he had had winged slippers like those which the nymphs had given to Perseus. So often had the student shown himself at the tip-top of a nut tree, when only a moment before he had been standing on the ground. And then what showers of walnuts he had sent rattling down upon their heads for their busy little hands to gather into the baskets. In short, he had been as active as a squirrel or a monkey, and now, flinging himself down on the yellow leaves, seemed inclined to take a little rest. But children have no mercy nor consideration for anybody's weariness, and if you had but a single breath left, they would ask you to spend it telling them a story. "Cousin Eustace," said Cowslip, "that was a very nice story of the Gorgon's head. Do you think you could tell us another as good?" "Yes, child," said Eustace, pulling the brim of his cap over his eyes as if preparing for a nap. "I can tell you a dozen as good or better, if I choose." "Oh, Primrose and Periwinkle, did you hear what he said?" cried Cowslip, dancing with delight. "Cousin Eustace is going to tell us a dozen better stories than that about the Gorgon's head." "I did not promise you even one, you foolish little Cowslip," said Eustace, half pettishly. "However, I suppose you must have it. This is the consequence of having earned a reputation. I wish I were a great deal duller than I am, or that I had never shown you half of my bright qualities, with which nature has endowed me, and then I might have my nap out of peace and comfort." But Cousin Eustace, as I think I have hinted before, was as fond of telling his stories as the children were of hearing them. His mind was in a free and happy state and took delight in its own activity, and scarcely required any external impulse to set it to work. How different is this spontaneous play of intellect from the trained diligence of maturer years, when toil has perhaps grown easy, as by long habit, and the day's work may have become essential to the day's comfort, although the rest of the matter has bubbled away. This remark, however, is not meant for the children to hear. Without further solicitation, Eustace Bright proceeded to tell the following really splendid story. It had come into his mind as he lay looking upward into the depths of the tree and observing how the touch of autumn had transmuted every one of its green leaves into what resembled the purest gold. And this change, which we all have us witnessed, is as wonderful as anything that Eustace told about in the story of Midas. The Golden Touch. Once upon a time, there lived a very rich man, and a king besides, whose name was Midas. And he had a little daughter whom nobody but myself ever heard of, and whose name I either never knew or have entirely forgotten. So because I love old names for little girls, I will choose to call her Marigold. This King Midas was fonder of gold than anything else in the world. He valued his royal crown chiefly because it was composed of that precious metal. If he loved anything better or half so well, it was the one little maiden who played so merrily around her father's footstool. But the more Midas loved his daughter, the more did he desire and seek for wealth. He thought, foolish man, that the best thing he could possibly do for his dear child would be to bequeath her the immensest pile of yellow glistening coin that have ever been heaped together since the world was made. Thus he gave all his thoughts and all of his time to this one perfect purpose. If he ever happened to gaze for an instant at the gold-tinted clouds of sunset, he wished that they were real gold and that they could be squeezed safely into his strong box. When little Marigold ran to meet him with a bunch of buttercups and dandelions, he used to say, "Pooh-pooh, child. If these flowers were as golden as they look, they would be worth plucking." And yet in his earlier days, before he was so entirely possessed with this insane desire for riches, King Midas had shown a great taste for flowers. He had planted a garden in which he grew the biggest and most beautiful and sweetest roses that any mortal had ever seen or smelled. These roses were still growing in the garden, as large, as lovely, and as fragrant as when Midas used to pass whole hours gazing at them and inhaling their perfume. But now, if he looked at them at all, it was only to calculate how much the garden would be worth if each of the innumerable rose petals were a thin plate of gold. And though he was once fond of music, in spite of an idle theory about his ears which were said to resemble those of an ass, the only music for poor Midas now was the chink of one coin against another. At length, as people always grow more and more foolish unless they take care to grow wiser and wiser, Midas had got to be so exceedingly unreasonable that he could scarcely bear to see or touch any object that was not gold. He made it his custom, therefore, to pass a large portion of every day in the dark and dreary apartment underground at the basement of his palace. It was where he kept his wealth. To this dismal hole, for it was little better than a dungeon, Midas betook himself whenever he wanted to be particularly happy. Here, after carefully locking the door, he would take a bag of gold coin, or a gold cup as big as a washbowl, or a heavy golden bar, or a peck measure of gold dust, and bring it from the obscure corners of the room into the one bright, narrow sunbeam that fell from the dungeon-like window. He valued the sunbeam for no other reason than that his treasure would not shine without its help. And then he would reckon over the coins in the bag, toss up the bar and catch it as it came down, shift the gold dust through his fingers, look at the funny image of his own face reflected in the burnished circumference of the cup, and whisper to himself, "Oh, Midas, rich King Midas, what a happy man art thou." Just one sip of tea. Got some wild berry zinger. The kettle's still warm if anyone else wants tea. But it was laughable to see how the image of his face kept grinning at him out of the polished surface of the cup. It seemed to be aware of his foolish behavior, and to have a naughty inclination to make fun of him. Midas called himself a happy man, but it felt that he was not yet quite so happy as he might be. The very tip-top of enjoyment would never be reached unless the whole world were to become his treasure room and be filled with yellow metal, which should be all his own. Now, I need hardly remind such wise little people as you that in the old times, when King Midas was alive, a great many things came to pass, which we should consider wonderful if they were to happen in our own day and country. And on the other hand, a great many things take place nowadays which seem not only wonderful to us, but at which the people of old times would have stared their eyes out. On the whole, I regard our own times as the strangest of the two. But however that may be, I must go on with my story. Midas was enjoying himself in his treasure room one day as usual, when he perceived a shadow fall over the heaps of gold, and, looking suddenly up, what should he behold but the figure of a stranger standing in the bright narrow sunbeam. It was a young man with a cheerful ruddy face. Whether it was that imagination of King Midas threw a yellow tinge over everything, or whatever the cause might be, he could not help fancying that the smile with which the stranger regarded him had a kind of golden radiance in it. Certainly, although his figure intercepted the sunshine, there was now a brighter gleam upon all the piled-up treasures than before. Even the remote corners of their share of it, and were lighted up, when the stranger smiled as the tips of flame and sparkles of fire. As Midas knew that he had carefully turned the key in the lock and that no mortal strength could possibly break into his treasure room, he of course concluded that the visitor must be something more than mortal. It is no matter about telling you who he was. In those days, when the earth was comparatively a new affair, it was supposed to be often the resort of beings endowed with supernatural powers, and who used to interest themselves in the joys and sorrows of men, women, and children, half playfully and half seriously. Midas had met such beings before now, and was not sorry to meet one of them again. The stranger's aspect, indeed, was a good-humored and kindly, if not beneficent, that it would have been unreasonable to suspect him of intending any mischief. It was far more probable that he came to do Midas a favor. And what could that favor be unless to multiply his heaps of treasure? The stranger gazed about the room, and when his illustrious smile glistened upon all the gold objects that were there, he turned again to Midas. "You are a wealthy man, friend Midas," he observed. "I doubt whether any other four walls in earth contain so much gold as you have contrived to pile in this room." "I have done pretty well," answered Midas in a discontented tone. But after all, it is but a trifle when you consider that it has taken me my whole life to get it together. If one could live 1,000 years, he might have time to grow rich." "What?" exclaimed the stranger. "Then you are not satisfied?" Midas shook his head. "And pray, what would satisfy you?" asked the stranger. "Merely for the curiosity of the thing, I should be glad to know." Midas paused and meditated. He felt a presentiment that this stranger, with such a golden luster and good-humored smile, had come hither with both the power and the purpose of gratifying his utmost wishes. Now, therefore, was the fortunate moment when he had to but speak to obtain whatever possible or seemingly impossible thing it might come into his head to ask. So he thought, and thought, "Hi, Moist, lovely to see you, babe." And thought, and heaped up one golden mountain upon another in his imagination, without being able to imagine them big enough. At last a bright idea occurred to King Midas. It seemed really as bright as the glistening metal which he loved so much. Raising his head, he looked the lustrous stranger in the face. "Well, Midas," observed the visitor, "I see that you have at length hit upon something that will satisfy you. Tell me your wish." "It is only this," replied Midas. "I am weary of collecting my treasures with so much trouble, and beholding the heap so diminutive after I have done my best. I wish everything that I touch could be changed to gold." The stranger's smile grew so very broad that it seemed to fill the room, like an outburst of sun gleaming into a shadowy dell, where the yellow autumnal leaves, for so looked lumps and particles of gold, lie strewn in the golden light. "The golden touch!" exclaimed he. "You certainly deserve credit, friend Midas, for striking out so brilliant a conception. But are you quite sure that this will satisfy you?" "How could it fail?" said Midas. "And will you ever regret the possession of it?" "What can induce me?" asked Midas. "I ask nothing else to render me perfectly happy." "Be it as you wish, then," replied the stranger, waving his hand in a token of farewell. "Tomorrow at sunrise you will find yourself gifted with the golden touch." The figure of the stranger then became exceedingly bright, and Midas had involuntarily closed his eyes. On opening them again, he beheld only one yellow sunbeam in the room, and all around him the glistening of the precious metal which he had spent his life hoarding up. "Hi, Eerie, love to see you." Whether Midas slept as usual that night, the story does not say. Asleep or awake, however, his mind was probably in the state of a child. Just a moment, a sip of tea while the page loads. Technical difficulties. This page is not loading. There we are. And we're back. Asleep or awake, however, his mind was probably in the state of a child's to whom a beautiful new plaything has been promised in the morning. At any rate, day had hardly peeped over the hills when King Midas was broad awake, stretching his arms out of bed, began to touch objects that were within his reach. He was anxious to prove whether the golden touch had really come according to the stranger's promise. So he laid his finger on a chair by the bedside and on various other things, but is grievously disappointed to perceive that they remained exactly the same substance as before. Indeed, he felt very much afraid that he had only dreamed of the lustrous stranger, or else that the latter had been making a game of him. And what a miserable affair would it be if, after all his hopes, Midas must content himself with what little gold he could scrape together by ordinary means, instead of creating it by touch. All this while it was only the gray of the morning, but with a streak of brightness along the edge of the sky where Midas could not see it. He lay in a very disconsolate mood, regretting the downfall of his hopes, and kept growing sadder and sadder until the earliest sunbeam shone through the window and gilded the ceiling over his head. It seemed to Midas that this bright yellow sunbeam had reflected in a rather singular way the white covering of the bed. Looking more closely what was his astonishment and delight, then he found that the linen fabric had been transmuted to what seemed a woven texture of the purest and brightest gold. The golden touch had come to him with the first sunbeam. Midas started up in a kind of joyful frenzy and ran about the room, grasping at everything that happened to be in his way. He seized one of the bedposts, and it became immediately a fluted golden pillar. He piled aside a window curtain in order to admit a clear spectacle of the wonders which he was performing, and the tassel grew heavy in his hand, a mass of gold. He took a book up from the table. At his first touch, it assumed the appearance of such splendidly bound, gilded-edge volume as one meets with nowadays. But on running his fingers through the leaves, behold, it was a bundle of thin gold plates, in which all of the wisdom of the book had grown illegible. He hurriedly put on his clothes, and was enraptured to see himself in a magnificent suit of gold cloth, which retained its flexibility and softness, although it burdened him a little with its weight. He drew out his handkerchief, which little Marigold had hemmed for him. That was likewise gold, with his dear child's neat and pretty stitches running along the border in gold thread. Somehow or other, this last transformation did not quite please King Midas. He would rather that his little daughter's handiwork have remained just the same as when she climbed on his knee and put it in his hand. But it was not worth the while to vex himself about a trifle. Midas now took his spectacles out of his pocket and put them on his nose, in order that he might see more distinctly what he was about. In those days, spectacles for common people had not been invented, but were already worn by kings. Else how could King Midas have any? To his great perplexity, however, excellent as glasses were, he discovered that he could not possibly see through them. But this was the most natural thing in the world, for on taking them off, the transparent crystals had turned into plates of yellow metal, and of course were worthless as spectacles, though valuable as gold. It struck Midas as rather inconvenient that with all his wealth he could never again be rich enough to own a pair of serviceable spectacles. "It's not a great matter, nevertheless," he said to himself very philosophically. "We cannot expect any great good without its being accompanied by some small inconvenience. The golden touch is worth the sacrifice of a pair of spectacles at least, if not one's very eyesight. My own eyes will serve for ordinary purposes, and little Marigold will soon be old enough to read to me." Wise King Midas was so exalted by his good fortune that the palace seemed not sufficiently spacious to contain him. He therefore went downstairs and smiled on observing that the balustrade of the staircase became a bar of burnished gold as his hand passed over it on his descent. He lifted the door latch. It was brass only a moment ago, but golden when his fingers quitted it, and emerged into the garden. Here, as it happened, he found a great number of beautiful roses in full bloom, and others in all stages of lovely bud and blossom. Very delicious was their fragrance in the morning. Their delicate blush was one of the fairest sights in the world, so gentle, so modest, and so full of sweet tranquility did these roses seem to be. But Midas knew a way to make them far more precious, according to his way of thinking, than roses had ever been before. So he took great pains in going from bush to bush and exercised his magic touch most indefatigably, until every individual flower and bud, and even the worms at the heart of some of them, were changed to gold. By the time the good work was completed, King Midas was summoned to breakfast, and as the morning air had given him an excellent appetite, he made haste back to the palace. What was usually King Midas' breakfast in the days of Midas, I really do not know and cannot stop now to investigate. To the best of my belief, however, on this particular morning, the breakfast consisted of hot cakes, some nice little brook trout, roasted potatoes, fresh boiled eggs, and coffee for the king himself, and a bowl of bread and milk for his daughter Marigold. At all events, this breakfast fit to set before the king, and whether he had it or not, King Midas would not have had a better. Little Marigold had not yet made her appearance. Her father ordered her to be called, and seating himself at the table awaited his child's coming in order to begin his own breakfast. To do Midas justice, he really loved his daughter, and loved her so much that the more this morning on account of the good fortune which had befallen him. It was not a great while before he heard her coming along the passageway, crying bitterly. This circumstance surprised him, because Marigold was one of the cheerfulest little people whom you could see in a summer's day, and hardly shed a thimbleful of tears in a 12-month. When Midas heard her sobs, he was determined to put little Marigold into better spirits by an agreeable surprise, so, leaning across the table, he touched his daughter's bowl, which was a china one, with pretty figures all around it, and transmuted it into gleaming gold. Meanwhile, Marigold slowly and disconsolately opened the door and showed herself, with her apron at her knees, still sobbing as if her heart would break. "How now, my little lady?" cried Midas. "Pray, what is the matter with you this bright morning?" Marigold, without taking the apron from her eyes, held out her hand, in which one of the roses which Midas had so recently transmuted. "Beautiful!" exclaimed her father. "And what is there in this magnificent rose to make you cry?" "Ah, dear father," answered the child, as well as her sobs would let her, "it's not beautiful. It's the ugliest flower that ever grew. As soon as I was dressed, I ran into the garden to gather some roses for you, because I know that you like them, and like them the better gathered by your little daughter, but, oh, dear me, what do you think has happened? Such a misfortune! All the beautiful roses that smelled so sweetly and had so many lovely blushes are blighted and spoiled. They are grown quite yellow, as you see this one, and no longer have any fragrance. What's the matter with them?" "Pooh, my dear little girl, pray don't cry about it." Midas, who was ashamed to confess that he himself had wrought the change which so greatly afflicted her. "Sit down and eat your bread and milk. You'll find it easy enough to exchange a golden rose like that, which will last hundreds of years, for an ordinary one which will wither in a day." "I don't care for roses such as this," cried Marigold, tossing it contemptuously away. "It has no smell, and the hard petals prick my nose." The child now sat down at the table. but was so occupied with her grief for the blighted roses that she did not even notice the wonderful transmutation of her china bowl. Perhaps this was all the better, for Marigold was accustomed to taking pleasure in looking at the queer figurines and the strange trees and houses that were painted on the circumference of the bowl. And these ornaments were now entirely lost in the yellow hue of the metal. Midas, meanwhile, had poured out a cup of coffee, and, as a matter of course, the coffee pot, whatever metal it may have been when he took it, was gold when he had set it down. He thought to himself it was rather an extravagant style of splendor in a king of his simple habits to breakfast off a surface of gold, and began to be puzzled with the difficulty of keeping his treasures safe. The cupboard in the kitchen would no longer be a secure place to deposit articles so valuable as golden bowls and coffee pots. Amid these thoughts, he lifted a spoonful of coffee to his lips, and sipping it, was astonished to perceive that the instant his lips touched the liquid, it became molten gold, and next moment hardened into a lump. exclaimed Midas, rather aghast. "What is the matter, father?" Little Marigold, gazing up at him, tears still in her eyes. "Nothing, child, nothing," said Midas. "Eat your milk before it gets quite cold." He took one of the nice little trouts on his plate and, by way of experiment, touched the tail with his finger. To his horror, it was immediately transmuted from an admirably fried brook trout into a goldfish, though not one of those goldfishes which people would often keep in glass globes as ornaments for the parlor. No, but it was really a metallic fish, and looked as if it had been very cunningly made by the nicest goldsmith in the world. Its little bones were now golden wires, its fins and tail were thin plates of gold, and there were marks of the fork in it, and all the delicate frothy appearance of a nicely fried fish exactly imitated in metal. A very pretty piece of work, as you may suppose, only King Midas, just at that moment, which would much rather have had a real trout on his dish than this elaborate and valuable imitation of one. "I don't quite see," he thought to himself, "how I'm to get any breakfast." He took one of the smoking hot cakes and had scarcely broken it when his cruel mortification, though a moment before had been the whitest wheat, it assumed a yellow hue of the Indian meal. To say the truth of it, it would have really been a hot Indian cake. Midas would have prized it a good deal than he did now, when its solidity had increased and its weight and made him too bitterly sensible that it was gold. Almost in despair, he helped himself to a boiled egg, which immediately underwent a change similar to those of the trout in the cake. The egg, indeed, may have been mistaken for one of those which the famous goose in the storybook was in the habit of laying. But King Midas was the only goose that had had anything to do with the matter. "Well, this is a quandary," he thought, leaning back in his chair, looking quite enviously at little Marigold, who was now eating her bread and milk with great satisfaction. "Such a costly breakfast before me, nothing that can be eaten." Hoping that, by dint of great dispatch, he might avoid what he now felt a considerable inconvenience, King Midas next snatched a hot potato in an attempt to cram it in his mouth and swallow it in a hurry. But the Golden Touch was too nimble for him. He found his mouth full of not a mealy potato, but of solid metal, which so burned his tongue that he roared aloud, and jumping up from the table began to dance and stamp out of the room, both in pain and affright. "Father, dear father," cried little Marigold, who was a very affectionate child, "pray, what is the matter? Have you burned your mouth?" "Ah, dear child," groaned Midas dolefully, "I don't know what is to become of your poor father." And truly, my dear little folks, did you ever hear Such a pitiable case in all your lives. Here was literally the richest breakfast that could be set before a king. And we're waiting for the page to load now. We'll take a sip of tea. Got the wild berry zinger. Nice caffeine-free tea. There we are. And its very richness made it absolutely good for nothing. The poorest laborer sitting down to his crust of bread and cup of water was far better off than King Midas, whose delicate food was really worth its weight in gold. And what was to be done? Already at breakfast, Midas was excessively hungry. Would he be less so by dinner time? And how ravenous would be his appetite for supper, which was undoubtedly to consist of some sort of indigestible dishes as those now before him? How many days, think you, would he survive the countenance of this rich fare? These reflections so troubled wise King Midas that he began to doubt whether, after all, riches are the one desirable thing in the world, or even the most desirable. But this was only a passing thought. So fascinated was Midas with the glitter of the yellow metal that he would still have refused to given up the golden touch for so paltry a consideration as a breakfast. Just imagine what price for one's meal's victuals. It would be the same as paying millions and millions of money, and as many millions as would take forever to reckon up, for some fried trout, an egg, a potato, a hot cake, and a cup of coffee. It would be quite too dear, thought Midas. Nevertheless, so great was his hunger and the perplexity of the situation that he again groaned aloud, and very grievously too. Our pretty Marigold could endure this no longer. She sat a moment, gazing at her father, trying with all the might of her little wits to find out what was the matter with him. Then, with a sweet and sorrowful impulse to comfort him, she started from her chair and, running to Midas, threw her arms affectionately about his knees. He bent down and kissed her, and felt that his little daughter's love was worth 1,000 times more than he had gained by the golden touch. "My precious, precious Marigold," cried he. But Marigold made no answer. Alas, what had he done? How fatal was the gift which the stranger had bestowed. The moment the lips of Midas touched Marigold's forehead, a change had taken place. Her sweet rosy face, so full of affection as it had been, assumed a glittering yellow color, with yellow teardrops congealing on her cheeks. Her beautiful brown ringlets took the same tint. Her soft and tender little form grew hard and inflexible within her father's encircling arms. Oh, terrible misfortune! The victim of his insatiable desire for wealth, little Marigold was a human child no longer, but a golden statue. Yes, there was, with the questioning look of love, grief, and pity hardened into her face. It was the prettiest and most woeful sight that ever mortal saw. All the features and tokens of Marigold were there. Even the beloved little dimple remained in her golden chin. But the more perfect was this resemblance, the greater the father's agony at beholding this golden image, which was all that was left him of his daughter. It had been a favorite phrase of Midas whenever he felt particularly fond of the child to say that she was worth her weight in gold. And now the phrase had become literally true. And now at last, when it was too late, he felt how infinitely a warm and tender heart that loved him exceeded the value of all the wealth that he could have piled up betwixt the earth and sky. It would be too sad a story if I were to tell you how Midas, in the fullness of his gratified desires, began to wring his hands and bemoan himself, and how he could neither bear to look at Marigold nor yet to look away from her. Except when his eyes were fixed on that image, he could not possibly believe that she was changed to gold. But stealing another glance, there was the precious little figure, with a yellow teardrop on its yellow cheek, and a look so piteous and tender that it seemed as if the very expression must needs soften the gold and make it flesh again. This, however, could not be. So Midas had only to wring his hands and to wish he were the poorest man in the wide world if the loss of all of his wealth would bring back the faintest rose color in his dear child's face. When he was in the tumult of despair, he suddenly beheld a stranger standing near the door. Midas bent down on his head without speaking, for he recognized the same figure which had to appear to him the day before in the treasure room and bestowed on him this disastrous faculty of golden touch. The stranger's countenance still wore a smile which seemed to shed a yellow luster all about the room, and gleamed a little on Marigold's image and on the other objects that had been transmuted by the touch of Midas. "Well, friend Midas," said the stranger, "pray, how do you succeed with the golden touch?" Midas shook his head. "I am very miserable," said he. "Very miserable indeed," exclaimed the stranger. "And how happens that? Have I not faithfully kept my promise to you? Have you not everything that your heart desired?" "Gold is not everything, and I have lost all that my heart really cared for." "Ah, so you have made a discovery since yesterday," observed the stranger. "Let us see then, which of these two things do you really think is worth the most? The gift of the golden touch, or 1 cup of clear cold water?" "Oh, blessed water!" exclaimed Midas. "It will never moisten my parched throat again." "The golden touch?" continued the stranger, "or a crust of bread?" "A piece of bread," answered Midas, "is worth all the gold on this earth." "The golden touch?" asked the stranger, "or your own little Marigold, warm, soft, and loving as she was an hour ago?" "Oh, my child, my dear child," cried poor Midas, wringing his hands. "I would not have given one small dimple on her chin for the power of changing this whole big earth into the lump of gold." "You are wiser than you were, King Midas," and the stranger, looking seriously at him. "Your own heart, I perceived, has not been entirely changed from flesh to gold. Were it so, your case would indeed be desperate. But you appear still capable of understanding that the commonest things, such as lie within everyone's grasp, are more valuable than the riches which so many mortals sigh and struggle after. Tell me now, do you sincerely desire to rid yourself of this golden touch?" "It is hateful to me," replied Midas. A fly settled on his nose, but immediately fell to the floor, for it too had become gold. Midas shuddered. "Go then," said the stranger, "and plunge into the river that glides past the bottom of your garden. Take likewise a vase of the same water, and sprinkle it over any object that you desire to change back again from gold into its former substance. If you do this in earnestness and sincerity, it may possibly repair the mischief which your avarice has occasioned." King Midas bowed low, and he lifted his head to the illustrious stranger, who had vanished. You will easily believe that Midas lost no time in snatching up a great earthen pitcher, but alas me, it was no longer earthen after he touched it. and hastened to the riverside. As he scampered along and forced his way through the shrubbery, it was positively marvelous to see how the foliage turned yellow behind him, as if the autumn had been there and nowhere else. On reaching the river's brink, he plunged headlong in without waiting so much as to pull off his shoes. Snorted King Midas as his head emerged out of the water. Well, this is a really refreshing bath, and I think it must have quite washed away the golden touch. And now for filling my pitcher. As he dipped the pitcher into the water, it gladdened his heart very to see it change from gold into the same good, honest earthen vessel which it had been before he touched it. He was so conscious also of the change within himself. A cold, hard, heavy weight seemed to have gone out of his bosom. No doubt his heart had been gradually losing its human substance and transmuting itself into insensible metal, but had now softened back again into flesh. Perceiving a violet that grew on the bank of the river, Midas touched it with his finger and was overjoyed to find that the delicate flower retained its purple hue, instead of undergoing a yellow blight. The curse of the golden touch had therefore really been removed from him. King Midas hastened back to the palace, and I suppose the servants knew not what to make of it when they saw their royal master so carefully bringing home an earthen pitcher of water. But that water which was to undo all the mischief of his folly had wrought was more precious to Midas than an ocean of molten gold could have been. The first thing he did, as you need hardly to be told, was to sprinkle handfuls over the golden figure of little Marigold. No sooner did it fall on her than you would have laughed to see how the rosy color came back into the dear child's cheek, and how she began to sneeze and sputter, and how astonished she was to find herself dripping wet with her father still throwing more water over her. "Pray do not, dear father," she cried. "See, you have made wet my nice frock, which I put on only this morning." But Marigold did not know she had been a little golden statue, nor could she remember anything that had happened since the moment she ran with outstretched arms to comfort King Midas. Her father did not think it necessary to tell his beloved child how very foolish he had been, but contented himself with showing how much wiser he had now grown. For this purpose, he led little Marigold into the garden, where he sprinkled all the remainder of the water over the rose bushes, and with such good effect that above 5,000 roses recovered their beautifulest bloom. There were two circumstances, however, as long as he lived, used to put King Midas in the mind of the golden touch. One was that the sands of the river sparkled like gold, and the other was that little Marigold's hair had now a golden tinge, which he had never observed in it before. She had been transmuted by the effect of his kiss. The change of the hue was really an improvement, and made Marigold's hair richer than in her babyhood. When King Midas had grown quite old, and used to trot Marigold's children on his knee, he was fond of telling them this marvelous story, pretty much as I have told you, and then he would stroke their glossy ringlets and tell them that their hair likewise had a rich shade of gold, which they had inherited from their mother. "And to tell you the truth, my precious little folks," quoth the King Midas, diligently trotting the children all the while, "ever since that morning I have hated the very sight of all other gold, save this." Shadowbrook, after the story. "Well, children?" inquired Eustace, who was very fond of eliciting a definite opinion from his auditors. "Did you ever in all your lives listen to a better story than this of the Golden Touch?" "Why, as to the story of King Midas," said saucy Primrose, It was a famous one thousands of years before Mr. Eustace Bright came into the world, and will continue to be so long after he quits it. But some people have what we may call the leaden touch, and make very dull and heavy whatever they lay their fingers upon. You are a smart child, Primrose, to be not yet in your teens, said Eustace, taken rather aback by the piquancy of her criticism. But you well know in your naughty little heart that I have burnished the old gold of Midas all anew, and have made it shine as it never shone before. And then that figure of Marigold, do you perceive no nice workmanship in that? And how finely I have brought out the deepened moral. What say you, Sweet Fern, Dandelion, Clover, Periwinkle? Would any of you, after hearing this story, be so foolish as to desire the faculty of changing things to gold? I should like, said Periwinkle, a girl of 10, to have the power of turning everything to gold with my right forefinger, but with my left forefinger I want the power of changing it back, if the first change does not please me. And I know what I would do this very afternoon. Pray tell me, said Eustace. Why, answered Periwinkle, I would touch every one of these golden leaves on the trees with my left forefinger to make them green again, so that we might have summer back once more, with no ugly winter in the meantime. Oh, Periwinkle, cried Eustace Bright, there you are wrong, and would do a great deal of mischief. Were I Midas, I would make nothing else but just such golden days as these, over and over again, all year through. My best thoughts always to come a little too late. Why did not I tell you how old King Midas came to America and changed the dusky autumn, such as it is in other countries, into the burnest beauty which it puts on here? He gilded the leaves of great volume of nature. Cousin Eustace, said Sweet Fern, a good little boy, who was always making particular inquiries about the precise height of giants and the littleness of fairies. How big was Marigold, and how much did she weigh after she turned to gold? She was about as tall as you are, replied Eustace, and as gold is very heavy, she weighed at least 2,000 pounds, and might have been coined into $30,000 or $40,000. I wish Primrose were worth half as much. Come, little people, let us clamber out of the dell and look about us. They did so. The sun was now an hour or two beyond its noontide mark, and filled the great hollow of the valley with its western radiance, so that it seemed to be brimming with mellow light, and to spill it over into the surrounding hillsides like golden wine out of a bowl. It was such a day that you could not help saying of it, there was never such a day before, although yesterday was just such a day, and tomorrow will be just such another. Ah, but there were very few of them in the 12-month circle. It is a remarkable peculiarity of these October days, at which each of them seems to occupy such a great deal of space, although the sun rises rather tardily at that season of the year, and goes to bed, as the little children ought to, at sober 6 o'clock or even earlier. We cannot, therefore, call the days long, but they appear somehow or another to make up for the shortness by their breadth. And when the cool night comes, we are conscious of having enjoyed a big armful of life since morning. Come, children, come, cried Eustace Bright. More nuts, more nuts, more nuts! Fill all your baskets, and at Christmas time I will crack them for you and tell you beautiful stories. So away they went, all of them, in excellent spirits, except for little Dandelion, who, I'm sorry to tell you, had been sitting on a chestnut burr, and was stuck as full as a pincushion of its prickles. Dear me, how uncomfortable he must have felt. Poor Dandelion, Well, my loves, that is the end of that chapter. And I think that is the end of our time together tonight. Moist, thank you for the hydrate. I will have a little more of my tea. Thank you so much for joining me, babies and gentle beans. It was lovely to see you. And I hope you have a great evening. I will talk to you again soon.